Thank you, Mr President. I rise tonight to talk about an issue that, in fact, I haven't talked about for some time in this chamber, and that is the impact of the Montara oil spill. Last month, I visited East Nusa Tenggara, West Timor, to meet with officials there, to meet with fishers, community members and seaweed farmers. And it looks like the Montara oil spill has had a significant impact on that, on those communities, and I'll go into that shortly. But before I do, I would like to remind us about where this started. And that was on the 21st of August in 2009, when the Montara wellhead exploded in Australian waters, on the Australian waters of the Timor Sea, and of course spilt thousands and thousands of litres of oil into the ocean. How much we don't know, because that was never officially measured. That oil gushed unchecked till the 3rd of November for 74 days. The oil was carried quite long distances by the currents, and the sheen upon the ocean at various times affected areas as large as 90,000 square kilometres. It was the largest offshore oil platform spill in Australia's history, and the AMSA, Australian Maritime Safety Authority, dispersed dispersants on the oil at estimates, they told me, 184,135 litres of dispersants. Some of those dispersants, such as Corex 9527A and Corex 9500, were used, and they have subsequently been shown to be toxic. Some much more highly toxic than people were aware of. They've been linked to damage to human and marine life, and to severe health consequences. Those dispersants were also used in the Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Just reminding the chamber that in 2010, the report of the Montara Commission of Inquiry, that was in fact the inquiry that was established by the Australian government, found that the way in which the company responsible, which is PTTP Australasia, operated the Montara oil field, and I quote, did not come within a bull's roar of sensible oil field practice. The blowout, they said, was not a reflection of an unfortunate incident or of bad luck. What happened was an accident waiting to happen. PTTP have subsequently fined, and in fact then had to put in place a plan of action, action plan to address the bad and poor practices that resulted in this spill. And in fact, the government of the previous government significantly amended the oil and gas regulations in Australia. And I will remind the chamber that the Northern Territory government at that time was responsible for the regulation, and the inquiry also found very poor management of the regulatory process, and that's also changed. At the time of the spill, that it was established that the oil spill did go into Indonesian waters. At first there was some dispute with the company about whether that had in fact happened, and fortunately satellite imagery, not provided by the government or the company but in fact by SkyTruth, clearly established that. The local community in Nusa Tenggara also provided some oil samples, which I then provided to the Commission of Inquiry, and it was established that oil that had gone into Indonesian waters was in fact oil from the Montara oil spill. What wasn't tracked, or I don't think understood at the time, was that the use of the dispersants with the oil creates what they call a mousse, and it changes the particles and drops them out of, for a start, drops them out of the off the surface into the water profile, but also apparently causes a mousse that causes the spread of the oil and the damage much further. At the time, and I did speak about this in the chamber on several occasions, at the time the people of Roti and of East Nusa Tenggara also highlighted that they were extremely concerned about the impact of the oil spill on fishers who are legally allowed to fish in the area that was affected by the oil, but also on seaweed farms. The government, Australian government, worked with the company to ensure that there were studies done in Australian waters. Unfortunately, there was no studies done in Indonesian waters. So we have no understanding of what impact this spill had on Indonesian waters, on the fish stocks in Indonesian waters, on Roti and on East Nusa Tenggara. So I was invited up to speak at a seminar 2 weeks ago in West Timor, which I was very fortunately enough able to attend. And at that time I also met with communities. I went to a community called Tablalong, where in fact 800 concerned community members came to a public meeting. There were so many people in the church. In fact, it was held in a church, and many people outside. And I got to hear their accounts of what has happened to them and the impact that has been felt by their communities. So here you have communities that had, some of them fairly recently gone into seaweed farming as a way of obviously of earning income. And I heard how their production had fallen very significantly from 500, for example, in the village in which I met, from 500 tonnes production of seaweed to 10 tonnes. I heard from, in fact, the regional fisheries officer, how production of fish had gone down from what was originally around 180,000 tonnes down to what is now 70,000 tonnes. I heard from the fishers how red snapper, lobster, sardines, now they couldn't fish those, they couldn't catch them, in fact have had to change their fishing grounds, and instead of having to travel 2 days to their fishing grounds, they now have to take up to 7 days travel. I heard how the number of boats in these villages, fishing boats, had significantly reduced from hundreds to less than 100 in many of the villages, how fishers had lost their jobs because they could no longer fish. Now the point here is we don't know if the drop in production of seaweed farming, because what's happened is the production has dropped right off. There's now a scaly disease on these seaweed farms, and people are no longer able to make their livelihoods from seaweed farming. Fishers, as I've articulated, are no longer to fish. Tablalong, the village that we had the public meeting in, you could tell it was once a very prosperous village because of the seaweed farming. Other villages, again, very prosperous. You could see they were in decline because they could no longer either fish or seaweed farm. We don't know if, in fact, the Montara oil spill has caused this damage, and the dispersants. I've got to say the oil and the dispersants, because we don't know whether that moose I was talking about, or the dispersants, or the oil has impacted on these villages and on these fishing and on seaweed farms. But we owe it to these communities to have a look. And so that's what the community's message to me was: please ask the Australian government to take some leadership here. Please ask them to require a study to be undertaken. And I believe it's incumbent on the Australian government to take that leadership, because it was our poor regulatory practice, along with the company, and I'll get to the company in a minute, along with the company, who have a responsibility. It was failures by both. It was failures of our regulatory practice and gross failures on the company's behalf. So the company has a responsibility. But if they are not going to take up the responsibility, we need leadership by the Australian government to require a study to be done of what these impacts are. I heard from experts at the seminar that I was at that you could still do the studies and still establish whether the oil and the dispersants, because of particular marking, chasing the markers process, you can study whether that's still in the marine environment, still in the sediments, so we can establish whether it has had an impact. We owe it to those communities to carry out those studies, and I urge the Australian government to take some leadership here, and I desperately urge the company, PTTEP Australasia, to please talk to these fishers, put the money into the study, and let's establish what's really happened to these villages.